On an autumn evening in 1945, American military doctors worked through the night to save the life of a dying man, fighting to keep his heart beating, giving him American blood through a transfusion. And they did it not out of mercy, but because they were determined to see him hang. The man on the table was Hideki Tojo, the prime minister who had led Japan into the war and signed off on the attack at Pearl Harbor. When the Americans came to arrest him, he had put a pistol to his chest and pulled the trigger rather than be taken alive. He had missed his own heart. And so the men who had crossed an ocean to bring him to justice now bent every effort to undo what he had done to himself, to drag him back from death, restore him to health, and keep him alive long enough to be tried in open court and condemned before the world. This is the story of that trial, and of the strange, deliberate cruelty of keeping a man alive only so that he could be judged. The war in the Pacific had ended in August of 1945, but its ending was not the same thing as its conclusion. The surrender stopped the killing. It did not answer for it. As American forces moved into a defeated and occupied Japan, a question pressed on the victorious powers that no battle could settle. What was to be done with the men who had led the nation into a war of conquest that had consumed millions of lives across Asia and the Pacific? The Allies had already answered that question for the leaders of Germany, putting them on trial at Nuremberg for the crimes of their war. Now, they resolved to do the same in the East. The men who had governed wartime Japan, the ministers, the commanders, the architects of the policies that had carried the empire from Manchuria to Pearl Harbor and beyond, would not simply be imprisoned or quietly removed. They would be brought before a court, charged, tried, and held to account in public, with the world watching. The reckoning would take the form of law. The court that would do this was given a formal and deliberately heavy name: the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. It would sit in Tokyo, in the requisitioned hall of a former military academy at Ichigaya, a building that had once helped train the officers of the army now in the dock, turned into the courtroom where that army's leaders would answer for the war they had waged. The choice of place carried its own meaning. The institution that had produced Japan's war was made to host the trial of the men who had run it. Judges came from the victorious Allied nations, 11 of them, to sit on a single long bench. A chief prosecutor was appointed to lead the case for the prosecution, and a roster of defendants was drawn up, the most senior surviving figures of the wartime state, the men the Allies judged most responsible for taking Japan to war and for how that war had been conducted. But before any of them could be tried, they had first to be taken. And that was where the paradox at the heart of this story began. When American forces moved to arrest the wartime leadership in September of 1945, some of the accused chose not to be taken alive. The most prominent of them, the former prime minister, received the officers sent to arrest him, and then, rather than surrender to them, attempted to end his own life with a pistol. He did not succeed. The wound was grave, but it was not immediately fatal, and the Americans who had come for him were not prepared to let him die. He was a man they intended to put at the very center of their trial, and a defendant who killed himself before judgment would rob that trial of its central figure and hand him, in the eyes of many, a kind of escape. So they did the one thing that, on its face, made no sense. They fought to save the life of a man they meant to hang. The tribunal that convened in Tokyo in the spring of 1946 was built on the model of the trial then underway at Nuremberg, but it was its own creation, shaped by the particular character of the war in the Pacific. 11 judges sat on the long bench, one from each of the Allied nations that had a stake in the verdict, and the proceedings were conducted under a charter that defined the crimes the court would try and the rules by which it would try them. Presiding over the bench was an Australian jurist, William Webb, who held the difficult task of running a courtroom in which testimony had to pass through interpreters into many languages, in which the defendants' fates would be argued for years, and in which every ruling would be scrutinized by a watching world. The court's authority rested entirely on the fact of victory. It was the conquerors sitting in judgment on the conquered, and that fact, more than any other, would shape every argument made about whether the trial was justice or merely its appearance.
Leading the case against the accused was the chief prosecutor, an American lawyer named Joseph Keenan, who headed an international prosecution team drawn from the Allied nations. The case they assembled was vast in scope. Where an ordinary criminal trial concerns a single act, the prosecution at Tokyo set out to put an entire war on trial. To trace, through years of documents and testimony, the path by which Japan had moved from the seizure of Manchuria in the early 1930s through the long war in China and on to the attack that brought the United States into the conflict. The defendants were to be held responsible not merely for particular battles or orders, but for the whole design of aggressive war and for the conduct of that war, as it had fallen on soldiers and civilians and prisoners across half the world. It was an immense undertaking, and it would make the Tokyo trial one of the longest in modern history, running for well over 2 years before a verdict was reached.
In the dock sat 28 men, the defendants the Allies had designated as bearing the gravest responsibility, the category the charter called Class A. The leaders accused of the crime of waging aggressive war. They were former prime ministers and foreign ministers, senior commanders of the army and navy, ambassadors and ideologues, the men who had held the levers of the wartime state. They were not the only Japanese tried for war crimes. Thousands of others faced separate proceedings elsewhere for specific atrocities. But the Tokyo tribunal concerned itself with those at the very top, the men charged with the decisions that had set the whole machinery of war in motion. To bring them all into a single courtroom and try them together on a charge of having jointly led a nation into a war of aggression was something new in the practice of nations, and deeply controversial, for it asked a court to judge as a crime the very act of going to war.
That controversy ran through the trial from its first day. The defense, and many observers since, argued that the proceedings were flawed at their foundation, that to charge men with the crime of aggressive war was to punish them under a law written after the fact, and that a court composed entirely of the victors could not sit in true impartiality over the vanquished. Critics gave it a name that has clung to it ever since: victor's justice. Against this stood the case for the trial, that the alternative to law was not innocence, but summary vengeance, the shooting of the defeated leadership without record or hearing, as some had urged, and that a documented, public trial, whatever its imperfections, established a record of what had been done and asserted the principle that those who launch aggressive war may be held to answer for it. The argument was never settled in that courtroom, and it has not been settled since. But the trial went forward, and at its center, kept alive for exactly this purpose, was the man the Americans had refused to let die.
Of all the men in the dock, one drew the eyes of the world above the rest. Hideki Tojo had been Prime Minister of Japan at the moment the nation went to war with the United States, the head of government when the attack on Pearl Harbor was launched in December of 1941. To the American public, he was the face of the enemy at the top, the name most closely tied to the day that had brought the country into the war. Restored to health after the Americans had saved him from his own bullet, he now sat in the courtroom at Ichigaya as the trial's central figure, the leader who had presided over the decision for war, called to answer for it before the very nation he had attacked. There was a grim symmetry in it that no one missed. The man who had ordered the blow against Pearl Harbor, kept alive by Pearl Harbor's victors, brought to the same court as the men who had served beneath him, to face the charges that the prosecution had spent months preparing.
The evidence that filled the long months of the trial was, above all, paper. This was not a case argued chiefly through eyewitnesses to violence. It was argued through the documents of a state at war. Cabinet minutes, diplomatic cables, operational orders, the written record by which decisions had been made and transmitted. The prosecution traced through that record the chain of policy that had led from Japan's earlier conquests to the decision for war against the United States and the wider Allied powers. The attack on Pearl Harbor sat at the heart of the case, framed by the prosecution not as a sudden act, but as the culmination of a deliberate course. A war begun in their telling without the warning the laws of nations required. Day after day, the exhibits were entered, translated, and read into the record, building the prosecution's argument that the war had been planned and chosen at the top, and that the men in the dock had been the ones who planned and chose it.
When the trial reached him, the former prime minister did not deny his role. And that was, in its way, the most striking thing about his defense. He did not claim that he had been a bystander or that the decisions had been made over his head. Instead, he accepted responsibility for the course Japan had taken while he led it, and argued that what the nation had done, it had done as an act of self-preservation, as its leaders had seen it at the time. Not, in his framing, a crime against peace, but a war he believed had been forced upon Japan by the pressures bearing down on it. He defended the decision, rather than disowning it. Whatever one makes of that argument, it placed him squarely at the center of the case the prosecution was making, and it spared the court the spectacle of a leader blaming his subordinates for a war he had led. He stood by what he had done, and in doing so, he made himself the embodiment of the charge the whole tribunal had been built to try.
There was, however, a silence at the center of the proceedings that everyone in the courtroom understood, and almost no one named aloud. The man in whose name the war had been waged, the head of the Japanese state throughout it, was not in the dock. The decision had been made in the highest councils of the occupation that the emperor, Hirohito, would not be charged, that he would be left out of the trial entirely, retained as a stabilizing figure for an occupied nation rather than placed among the accused. The reasoning was political, that to try and condemn the sovereign in whose name the soldiers had fought might inflame the country the occupation was trying to govern. Whatever its merits, the effect was unmistakable. The trial that set out to fix responsibility for the war at the very top stopped short of the very top. The men in the dock answered for a war waged in a name that would never appear among the defendants. And that absence has hung over the verdict ever since.
After more than 2 years of testimony, the tribunal delivered its judgment in November of 1948. The reading of it took days, a vast document working through the history of the war and the case against each defendant in turn. When it was done, the verdicts were pronounced. The great majority of the accused were found guilty on one or more of the charges against them. The sentences ranged from terms of imprisonment to the gravest penalty the court could impose.
Guilty on all counts.
7 of the defendants were sentenced to death, judged to bear the heaviest responsibility for the war and for the crimes committed in its course. Among the 7 was the former prime minister, whose life the Americans had fought to save 3 years before. The court that had been built to try him had reached the end its prosecutors had intended from the start. He had been judged in open court on a full record and condemned to die, the outcome for which he had been kept alive.
The condemned men were held at Sugamo Prison in Tokyo, a walled compound that the occupation had taken over to house those convicted by the tribunal and the other war crimes courts. There, the 7 sentenced to death waded through the appeals and reviews that followed the verdict, in cells behind the prison's high walls, while the last legal questions were resolved and the sentences confirmed. Sugamo became in those years the physical center of the reckoning, the place where the judgment passed in the courtroom at Ichigaya would finally be carried out. Its name entered the record of the war's end as surely as the names of the battles had entered the record of its course. The trial had been the public reckoning, conducted in the light of the courtroom before the world's press. What followed at Sugamo was the private one, behind the walls, where the sentences became fact.
In the final weeks of December of 1948, the 7 death sentences were carried out at Sugamo. The man who had been prime minister at Pearl Harbor, who had put a bullet into his own chest rather than be taken, who had been saved by American doctors and American blood, who had been tried over 2 years and condemned in open court, met the end the tribunal had decreed for him. The deliberate, strange logic that had run through the whole affair reached its conclusion. He had been kept alive in 1945 for precisely this, so that his death would come not by his own hand and on his own terms, but by the judgment of the court he had been forced to face. The escape he had reached for when the Americans first came for him had been denied to him, and the sentence had been served instead in the form his accusers had insisted upon. A death pronounced by law, after a trial, in the name of the war's reckoning, rather than his own.
It is worth setting the 7 death sentences against the scope of the war they were meant to answer for, because the contrast is part of what makes the trial so endlessly argued. A war that had killed many millions of people across Asia and the Pacific ended at the level of its highest leadership in the conviction of a few dozen men and the execution of 7. To some, that was the rule of law asserting itself where vengeance might have ruled. A measured, documented accounting rather than a massacre of the defeated. To others, it was a reckoning that fell far short of the crime, that reached only a handful of figures, while the war's vast suffering went largely unanswered, and that pointedly spared the one figure at the very summit of the state. Both views have weight. What is certain is that the Tokyo Tribunal, with all its disputed authority, produced something that mere conquest could not have. A record, sworn and examined and preserved, of how a nation had come to make its war.
The Tokyo trial has never settled into a single agreed meaning, and perhaps it never will. Held up beside Nuremberg, its European counterpart, it shares the same ambition and the same vulnerability. The attempt to answer the crimes of a war through the orderly machinery of law, and the unavoidable fact that the law was being applied by the winners to the losers. Its defenders point to what it created, a public, documented reckoning that asserted for the first time on such a scale in the Pacific that the men who lead nations into aggressive war can be made to answer for it. Its critics point to what it could not escape, a charge framed after the fact, a bench composed wholly of the victorious, and a conspicuous absence at the top of the chart of responsibility. The honest verdict on the trial is that it was both things at once, a genuine act of law and an exercise of the victor's power, and the two cannot be cleanly separated.
The paradox at the heart of it remains the part that is hardest to forget. The American doctors who fought to save the Prime Minister's life in 1945 were not moved by forgiveness. They were preserving a defendant. Their work to keep him alive was an act of justice in the coldest sense of the word, the determination that he would not be permitted to choose his own death, that he would instead be made to face the court, hear the charges, and receive his sentence in the open. There is something unsettling in that, and the trial never resolved it. A man can be saved so that he can be killed. An enemy can be kept alive precisely so that he can be condemned. The medical fight to keep a heart beating and the legal fight to stop a heart, 3 years apart, were aimed at the same end. That is what Victor's justice looked like at its most literal. Not mercy, and not vengeance either, but the insistence that...
And then there is the silence the trial left behind, the responsibility it reached toward but did not touch.
By leaving the head of state out of the dock, the tribunal drew a line above which its accounting would not go. And in doing so, it shaped how Japan and the world would remember the war for generations. The men who were tried became, in the record, the bearers of a responsibility that in life had been shared more widely. Whether that was a wise act of statecraft for an occupied nation or a failure of the very justice the trial claimed to serve is one more question the courtroom could not answer. What the trial fixed, it fixed unevenly. It named some and not others. It reached the prime minister and not the figure above him. The reckoning of the Pacific War, conducted in that requisitioned Academy Hall, was real, but it was partial. And the shape of what it left out is as much a part of its legacy as what it judged.
The trial at Tokyo was meant to close the book on the war, to take the conflict that had ended on the battlefield and bring it to a final accounting in the courtroom. But there is a strange truth buried in the timeline of that ending, one that the surrender ceremony and the tribunal alike tend to obscure. The war did not actually stop everywhere on the day it was announced. In the far north, in the cold and fog of the Coral Islands, the fighting went on, after the Emperor's broadcast had told the world that Japan had surrendered. The Soviet Union, entering the war against Japan only in its last days, pressed an invasion down the island chain, and on a bleak northern island called Shumshu, a battle was fought after the war was supposed to be over. Soldiers killing and dying for ground in a conflict that the rest of the world believed had already ended. Next on Torah Files, the battle that came after the surrender. The last fighting of the Pacific War, on an island most have never heard of. Torah Files tells the untold history of the Pacific War, one episode at a time. Subscribe to see the next chapter.